Gnosticism is an ancient spiritual tradition based on individually acquired knowledge, or gnosis. Gnosis is not the intellectual knowledge of modernity. It is an ancient wisdom covered in black. Black being mystery, black being the unknown, black being a reverence for that which we are humbled by, the vastness. It is an understanding which is missed by the rational eye of enlightenment. While most religions are structured on faith, Gnosticism lets the individual build his or her own religious structures through intimate, personal experience with and of the divine. Gnosticism does not depend on a church authority. Instead, it depends on an individual's ability to deepen into divine experience. Stephen Haller describes, quote, "Gnostic mind aspires to and eventually attains not faith, but a certain interior knowing that liberates one from unconsciousness and eventually transports one beyond the bounds of manifest existence itself." End quote, page 5. Gnosis seeks to attain the wisdom of the unknown that, when embodied, expands the growth of personality, because you find that which you don't know, you're unconscious of. With this experience of knowledge, the more you know, the less you know. As one becomes more deeply submerged into the spiritual experience, one discovers for oneself that something exists that is beyond definitions, beyond a creed or belief, boundless. It is the light and the darkness that births poetic justice. In the darkness, we cannot see, define, or map. This is the unconscious aspect of reality, the side of reality that science cannot measure. Perhaps it's the black dot in the white yang, and where we learn about the bounds of manifest existence. Some would call it a taste of Buddhahood or transcendence. The important thing is we experience for ourselves that there is something beyond. There's a parable of blind people coming across an elephant for the first time. And each person feels a different part of the elephant and thinks he or she understands what the elephant is. Yet the individual is only feeling one part of the body. And while each is correct in their fragmented truth about the elephant, what is the trunk, the leg, etc., none are able to conceptualize the entirety of the elephant. This parallels our little understanding of truth as individuals. We can have a taste of the truth, but we can't conceptualize the whole thing. That is, unless we're enlightened. And then maybe you can't. Maybe that's what enlightenment is. Maybe enlightenment is the experience of the elephant. Gnosticism, the unconscious and black, cannot show you the elephant, but they can give you a taste and illuminate that your map is incomplete. And then one knows and experiences for oneself that there is something beyond. There is the entire elephant. And an elephant may evoke the image of the Hindu god Ganesha, originator of Om, the sound of creation. In the Upanishads, they say if you understand the Om, you will transcend samsara. You will transcend this experience of reality. Gnosticism looks to Sophia, the companion of God and the embodiment of wisdom. In the Valentinian myths, she desires to know where she came from. She is an eon, born out of Zoe, life, and Logos, world, her parents. To know her origins, she must plunge deeply into herself. Her descent into her own black abyss throws off the balance of all of the eons, and this is why the figure Christos is created. He is born to rescue Sophia from the abyss. In rescuing her, he brings up Achamoth, the formless deity creating pain throughout the worlds. She is the lower Sophia. She is in pain at her own ignorance discovered through her dark descent. And through this pain emerges the elephant. The elements, those which create the world we know today. Next, Achamoth produces a son, the Demiurge, who becomes the creator of the people. Steeped in ignorance, he is a false representation of authority, as he is not the true Palerma, divine essence. In a way, the Demiurge is the father, and Achamoth, who came before, is the mother. A classic incestuous origin story. The myth goes on. In silence and secrecy, Achamoth breathes soul into people. Her whisper helps each person recall the true origins and is a reminder of what is beyond the illusions of this demiurge. A reminder of the elephant? The whole elephant? Many of the Gnostic myths parallel a vision of Maya, the Buddhist view that this world is an illusion. The Savior, Christos, is a unifying figure which acknowledges the dark as well as the light. Perhaps our modern consciousness desires a Christos-fashioned revival. In the modern era, only well-lit and clear-cut science and intellect is acknowledged. The general education of psychology. Many disdain Freud's legitimization of the dark, unconscious world and the other mystical origins of the field. The myth is a metaphor, implying that there is a secret voice in the dark recesses of the body, in the space between, which calls one towards true source. Matthews writes, "When every single being is returned to source, the demiurge shall cease to exist." Achamoth's breath is a remembrance of source. Importantly, it can only be heard by the individual, and it speaks so gently, it requires something like deep silence to be heard. Deep and silence are the first. They are Sophia's grandparents, creators of Zoe and Logos, the first parents whom hold the true wisdom. Eastern traditions describe a cloud of Maya around the world. This is the deceptive aspect of reality where physical existence leads many to believe that the manifest reality is the end-all be-all. Maya, which creates a false authority similar to the demiurge, entangles us within material aspirations. Maya ties people to the seductions of the world, leading many people away from the unknowable nature of God. Eastern wisdom guides one to find the path to God, or caps lock as self, or space, or the ground of being, whatever you want to call it. Once again, through sitting in the deep silence of meditation. Eastern philosophy implores people to turn away from their worldly urges in order to return to the true creators, as the Gnostics do. Possibly, depth psychology, in its affinity for the dark, is sounding the call as well. Depth psychology, becoming lost to the overly rationalistic touch of academia, is a psychology which parallels the Gnostic principles. One can ascertain from the word depth where it is located. It has dived into the black abyss with Sophia. This is a psychology who is curious to know the unknown and has learned, as Sophia did, that some things cannot be understood with certainty or precision. The image of a dream emerges out of a dark slumber, out of an unconscious state, and its meaning can never be interpreted for certain. The images are illuminations, psychic revelations, covered in black. What American therapy is today has developed out of 3 models of psychotherapy: psychoanalytic, where the depths are, behaviorism, and humanism. Yet the history of psychology extends back much further to shamans, mediums, and even magicians. Magic, what was once a healing connection to the divine, modernity has developed into tricks of illusion, divorced from the spiritual realm completely. The shift in magic mirrors a world disenchanted and rationalized out of any acknowledgement of darkness, maybe of divineness. Technologized, modern people see through the metaphor of the computer, inputs and outputs from A to B, semantic networks, cognitive economies, and minds mapped using statistics. The mythic structure emerges. But this myth forgot black. Here's our current theory. Mind is computer. Our vision, our theories are mythically structured. Beverly Zabarsky quotes psychological theorist Julian James, who argued that, quote, "The history of science is essential to that of psychology. Each age has described consciousness in terms of the images of its external gestalt," end quote, page XL. He gives examples. In Greece, the physical environment held vast space, which evoked freedom in the mythic imagination. When geological discoveries came, consciousness was conceptualized in a layered format, and with a rise in science and chemistry at the end of the 19th century, the mind became a place of physiological conjunctions, stimulating productions of chemically derived impulses. Thus, psychological models are products of their time, erupting from the imagination located in the culture. These, quote, external gestalts seem to form as boundaries for collective fantasy, whether scientific or artistic. The Latin root of psychology is psyche, meaning breath, life, or soul, and ology, derived from logos, meaning speak, word, or reason. Therefore, the mission of psychology is to give order to the psyche, possibly even to find a reason, logos, for life, psyche, to find the meaning of incarnation itself. These are questions that cannot be answered by making statistical graphs of the population. These questions, the question of meaning, requires an eye for the poetic. It requires an answer that acknowledges the black veil over our eyes. Depth psychologist and German speaker Christine Downing suggests, quote, "To apprehend Freud's logos of the psyche, it seems to me essential to know that he consistently uses the word Seele, where the English translation gives us mind, mental structure, or mental organization. Seele is the German word for soul." Page 61. Freud knew that to apprehend one's psychology required the investigation of the soul, something much different than the mind. Yet today, psychology seems to still be looking for the mind. Perhaps with a different interpretation of Freud's Seele, the study of psychology would be much different than it is today. And that is just a whole other story having to do with basically his work being burned up by the Nazis, and nobody really cared about American psychology. But then World War II happened, and all they had was the American psychology, and that's why American psychology became so big. But psychology was all over Germany. They considered it a, quote, Jewish science. The only not Jewish person really in it was Jung. And anyway, that's just a whole whoopsies. But back to what we were talking about. Downing continues. Soul is, in a sense, a metaphor, a myth. It dwells in the body, but it can't be located anatomically. Page 61. If soul lives in the body, it would follow that it must be experienced by the body to be understood. The soul talks through body movement, emotional experiences, symptoms of the body. As Downing writes, soul is a myth, therefore, it can only be understood rationally as much as it can be understood rationally as such. This is most likely why people have created folktales, mythologies, and pantheons of gods since consciousness began, and why Freud turned to myth to locate the stories of the soul, such as with narcissism, Eros, and the Oedipus complex. Freud was given the gift of artistic interpretation, and he interpreted the story of the soul, or began to, for civilization itself. Yet the stories are endless. A black abyss. This is why psychological theories should not be taken as fact. Perhaps they could be identified as metaphors, and the theorists as artists painting pictures, subjective interpretations of the psyche. Jeanette Paris describes that one never knows the meaning of a poem, yet it still teaches and inspires. It has, quote, evocative power, page 80. This is a great image for the mind. One can never really know what is going on, but glimpses are caught and interpreted using the imaginative senses. Many, including Paris and founder of archetypal psychology, James Hillman, have suggested throwing out the term unconscious for imagination. Paris claims that the unconscious is not real and should never be classified as such. We don't know it really, as the unconscious is a term for that which we don't know. Page 84. She remembers Freud and his advice that medical training was the worst choice for an analyst. He suggested that one is best equipped for the psychotherapeutic procedure through being well read in culture, history, philosophy, the arts, anthropology, the humanities. Paris suggests a shift for psychology from the medical to the artistic. She discusses archetypal psychology as, quote, in the camp of the humanities, because our inner cinema is not so concerned with objective reality that it ignores the other terrains for experience. Inner life is a virtual production whose truth is of a kind we call artistic truth. End quote, page 224. Inner life is always creating stories, placing us in stories that have been told since time began. By connecting psychology to the archetypal, the mythic, we shift the focus away from the individual psychology and place psychology in the space of imagination, where it infuses and is infused by the entire culture, the entire history, and even the divine. Shamdasani writes of how the word psychology itself is a magic trick. It insinuates there is a thing, such as psychology, despite the fact that the different schools, ideas, and theories have been in battle since the beginning. What does hold steady is the layperson's adaptability. He concludes that what the last century of psychology has illuminated for us is, quote, the malleability of individuals who have been willing to adopt psychological concepts to view their life. Page 11. People crave story. The downfall is seeing the story in white light. When stories hold aspects of black, they cannot be interpreted with certainty. Physics is similar. We have theories, but there are known discontinuities in our current understanding of the nature of reality. Science works on hypothesis, high probabilities, not 100% answers. Our maps are incorrect fictions. Myths? Both psychology and physics demonstrate that the modern understanding of the world is not stable. There's something about reality the modern zeitgeist is missing. To know, we don't know. This is repressed by the rational attitude of today. We must remember that we don't know. We must make space for black. Rationalistic values ask us to repress subjective knowledge. Something is only true if it can be proven using the scientific method. Yet truth is not so easily defined. An additional risk is scientific authority. With scientific authority, there is a dependence on scientific authority to interpret the truth for everyone. Where is one's individual connection to truth? If one's truth is that water is scary, and thus one avoids water, this subjective truth creates a reality where water is avoided. The scientific mind would look at this truth and find rationale for why or why not water is scary. The symbolic mind would ask not whether this is true or not. Instead, it would deepen into the question, deepen into the abyss. What might water stand for psychologically? The unknown, the emotional, the intuitive realm. Is there an important memory associated with water? Was there an overbearing mother asking one to avoid water? This cannot be answered by the scientist or the psychologist. The one holding the truth is the individual dreamer, and he or she can find this truth through one's inner knowing. This is the other half of truth: symbolic, black, and artistic truth. Jung compared truth to food, which you wouldn't eat if it was indigestible. He says, from the archetypal perspective, what matters about truth is whether it is rooted in universal, timeless wisdom. If so, quote, you are swimming in and carried along by the universal current of instinctive mental behavior. And if you disagree, you have it against you. End quote, page 449. Many ignore or repress the history of psychology, beginning with shamanic healings and ritual magic, leading to the questionable theories of Mesmer's animal magnetism and Charcot's hypnosis, finally resulting in the legitimization of the unconscious in Freud's Sphinx as a pillar for a mythically structured unconscious. Psychology must remember its history. Depth psychologist Brandon Short posed a question to my class. Is the history of psychology the history of experts or fools? End quote. There's an old saying, the fool thinks he's a wise man, and the wise man knows he's a fool. Perhaps psychology should embark downwards to embrace the wisdom of the tumbling fool who releases the need for strict rationality. In the tarot, the fool is card number 0, a number of wholeness, a circle that can embrace black and white at once. Primitive medicine acknowledges rational treatments such as drugs, diet, medicines, and the like, while at the same time embracing irrational treatments that would hope to restore a lost soul, expel evil spirits. There are confessions, ceremonial healings, and rituals to appease the gods. Jung writes, quote, the life of the primitive is filled with constant regard for the ever-lurking possibility of psychic danger, end quote, page 17. He describes the magic rites to defend against, quote, unexpected dangerous tendencies of the unconscious, end quote, page 18. Modern civilization scoffs at such superstition, while riddled with anxiety, depression, addiction, personality disorders. Science has achieved great accomplishments in the external world, but the internal world, the world of Psyche, who lies in the dark with her lover Eros, is suffering. Jung's antidote for the modern person was enchantment, what he called, quote, the oldest form of medicine, end quote, page 419. He claimed that the modern person must unite with the primitive person, thus consciously merging with what the primitive person is rooted in, an acknowledgement of the unconscious forces of nature, that which we can't rationally understand. So to re-enchant a force to balance the rationalism and the extroverted one-sided nature of this scientific obsession, not that science isn't beautiful, it is, but the one-sidedness. To balance this, another force must emerge. Magic. Magic was the beginning of man's instinct to gain power over nature. But rather than disconnecting from the forces of nature, magic attempted to merge with it. Magic's symbolic gestures, ritual performances, and sacred spaces allow for conscious acknowledgement of that which humanity forgot in its technological race. Perhaps it's time to remember magic. Since the dawning of consciousness, people have engaged with the magical nature of reality. This is not the external manifest nature, it is the internal symbolic nature, the nature of the mind, the mythic nature of the psyche. The modern person neglects to see the archetypal reality, this mythic reality, where stories are not just stories. Stories are the fabric, patterning reality itself. Even a tree has a beginning, a middle, and an end. Reality is symbolic because the psychic archetypal half of reality speaks in symbolic images. Symbolism is the language of the imagination, the language of story. It is the language of the unconscious life. The symbols are the archetypes. They are the living images at the bottom of the imagination, or the psyche, or the unconscious. We see them in reality. The symbolic nature of reality communicates. For example, colors hold meaning. They come from the rainbow, the bridge to God, Genesis 9:13. Jung claimed that numbers are not only measuring tools, they are archetypal entities. Thus, people have connections to and disdain for certain numbers. Life is really like a dream, and if we can't read the symbolism, we miss out on the irrational language of the imagination and the caps lock other, black half of reality. The language of the unconscious or the imagination is important to the question of psychology. The why of being, psycheology, cannot be rationally or concisely answered. It requires the wisdom of black language. The word Sophia means wisdom. We must learn to hear her whisper. Meaning is irrational. It must be derived from a conjunction between the unconsciously felt, psyche, and the consciously known, ology. This takes one beyond the clear-cut light of intellect and into the shadowy light of wisdom. Anila Jaffe writes, quote, "Life offers no interpretation, and to that extent it appears meaningless, but it has a nature that can be interpreted." End quote, page 148. This is where the modern person misses out, as modern reason has forgotten the symbolic language of interpretation. This is a collective roadblock on the contemporary quest for meaning. Quote, "Modern man is too rational, too smart, too much of a know-it-all, too far removed from nature and her contradictions to take his own intimations or images arising from his psyche seriously. He has forgotten how to create myths." Jaffe, end quote, page 149. To remember how to create myth, the modern person must remember black by orienting oneself towards the imaginal space, becoming comfortable in a bit of darkness, in a reality that doesn't provide clear-cut answers, where one must seek the answers for oneself. One must learn to imagine once again. Meaning can never be known for certain, as it vessels the conscious and the unconscious at once. Jaffe writes of meaning as an archetype, as a riddle of experience. She describes, quote, "Every statement about meaning, whether it be a hypothesis or a confession of faith, is a myth, a product partly of consciousness and partly of the unconscious." End quote, page 148. Meaning justifies existence. because it balances out its illusionary one-sidedness. She describes meaning as healing because it, quote, restores the connection with origin, with the source of psychic images, regeneration through a renewed and conscious relationship with a living spirit buried in the unconscious, end quote, page 149. Jung claims that man has always lived in a myth, which he described as, quote, a stream of archetypal ideas that goes on through the centuries through the individual, end quote, page 300. Myths are metaphors, poems with evocative power for the common human experiences and impulses. Myths help us understand the unconscious life going on underneath in the depths of being. Myth vessels evolutionary and ancestral underpinnings in metaphor, the only way to understand Black. Today, to live without myth, without Black consciously acknowledged, is to live without a connection to humanity, both historically and transculturally. And Jung calls this a disease, page 348. He claims that to know your myth is to find individual values and character. This is, quote, the creative background, end quote, of personality. Completely separated from myth, modern people are separated from the metaphorical part of the self. Science is a tool, a very powerful one. And as much good as it does, as much light as the Enlightenment has brought us, the psyche is compensatory on small and large scales. So much light creates a very large shadow. Jung claims that statistics create an average man who betrays, even destroys the individual as well as the society. While the scientific lens has powerfully freed man from the chains of nature, it has simultaneously dislodged human beings from their psychic world. We are disenchanted. Quote, a man is not complete when he lives in a world of statistic truth. He must live in the world of his mythological truth. It is the expression of what reality is. End quote. Page 348. Incomplete. We are not whole. Sophia is lost, and we ignore Achamoth's whisper because it is irrational, a voice in our head. It's not real. Magic could also be envisioned as an element of the religious outlook itself. Religion enchants as a device to become closer to the divine. It infuses the physical world with a non-physical meaning. Magic pulls one into the symbolic world. For a modern person, this is the integration of Black, which creates wholeness, the goal of Jungian therapy, and all therapy, really. Carl Rogers, the organismic experience, the wholeness of the child, the fool. With this wholeness, one acknowledges the literal and the non-literal truth. Perhaps the acknowledgement of magic is a holy act, part of living a whole or holy life. Jung sees how modern people unconsciously acknowledge the magical aspect of reality when they wish each other a good day or take off their hats before an authority. These gestures have magical and symbolic attributions that contemporary culture is acting out unconsciously. In losing the conscious recognition of these magical acts, we lose part of ourselves. He explains, quote, the loss of a soul. This is what happens when part of the psyche becomes unconscious again, end quote, page 17. Part of our life, the magical part, has been marked as illegitimate and has gone unconscious. We have intellectualized our magical self, the self connected to Black, out of existence. We have repressed it to the dark, unconscious world. Psyche demands Christos to fish it out. This is where therapy comes in. In depth psychology, the analyst serves to help one find his or her own Christos figure, who seeks to find those dark parts of the self and the reality that has been thrown away by a culture which sees the shadows as bad or impractical. Psychoanalysis seeks descent, retrieval, and integration using the irrational language of the psyche. Utilizing the symbolism of the dream or seeing the physically manifest symptoms as metaphors for instincts lost in the abyss, throwing off the balance in all the worlds, the analyst must work with the black using myth and metaphor. Magic works synergistically with this search. Israel Regardie writes, quote, analytical psychology, depth or psychoanalysis, and magic compromise, in my estimation, two halves or aspects of a single technical system whose goal is the integration of the human personality. End quote. Page 16. He goes on to discuss how magic requires the engagement of the spiritual part of man in order to discover the creative and intuitive parts of the personality. He describes magic as, quote, a technique for releasing the deeper levels of the unconscious, end quote, page 19. This is to dive into black, to merge with the symbolic world, or to remember how to imagine. Magic techniques include practices as simple as praying over your food and as complicated as ritual. On ritual, Aleister Crowley writes, quote, there is a single main definition of the object of all magical ritual. It is the uniting of the microcosm with the macrocosm, the invocation of the holy guardian angel, or, in the language of mysticism, union with God. End quote, page 31. Magic enchants because it acknowledges something larger than the individual person. With technology, the gods are people. They're tech bros, guys. Magic looks to something older, wiser, to humble oneself before. The elephant's ohm. Magic seeks to unite with the archetypal, the mythical. Many see magic as a pursuit of power over nature, through connections to magical forces. Yet, the power the magician seeks is actually to connect with the divine. To be empowered for the magician is to be grounded in that which is beyond, in the richness of the dark soil. Humbleness in the face of magic is important because it allows space for the divine voice to speak. This is a feeling, a listening relationship. It feels for a center between these two poles of reality, between the explainable physical manifestations and the invisible hand of God shaping them. Regardie sees the path of magic as a quest for the golden flower, which can only be attained by, quote, the conscious reconciliation of opposing forces, end quote, page 22. He describes, quote, it is the pursuit of this middle path which leads to the self-conquest and the steady growth of the golden flower, the awakening of the imprisoned soul within, end quote, page 23. This image is reminiscent of the alchemical operation seeking to free Mercurius, the soul imprisoned within matter. Alchemy is an ancient tradition which seeks to turn base metals into gold. Yet Jung claimed that alchemy is metaphor for the psychological journey to individuation or wholeness. People are the base metals to be turned into gold. The magical operation of alchemy desires to find the philosopher's stone, the gold, like the golden flower attained by the conjunction of two opposing forces. Quote, the greatest problem in psychology is the integration of opposites. Jung, end quote, page 227. These procedures are magical, as they are a metaphor. To deepen into the question of alchemy, we may ask, what allows for the union of two opposing forces? Perhaps love. The most irrational and symbolic force of experience. Perhaps love is our metaphor for God. Love is what makes union possible. Jung held, quote, "Nothing is possible without love, not even the process of alchemy, for love puts one in the mood to risk everything." End quote. Page 404. Sophia wanted to know her origins. Her love of knowledge inspired her plunge into darkness. Her union with darkness birthed the creation of the world which we know. Perhaps this suggests that we are in this world to know wisdom, ourselves, and eventually source. Jung described union as, quote, "mutual individuation," page 405. This is a vision of the development of both sides, the irrational and rational, then walking the middle path between the two in order to create wholeness, gold, the philosopher's stone. Sophia wanted to know her origins. Her love of knowledge inspired her plunge into darkness. Her union with darkness birthed the creation of the world which we know. Perhaps this suggests that we are in this world to know wisdom, ourselves, and eventually source. Jung described union as, quote, "mutual individuation," end quote, page 405. Are we individuating mutually our consciousness with the consciousness of the entire reality around us? Ourselves and other, the ultimate opposition to merge with everything? That is the union. This is a vision of the development of both sides, the irrational and rational, then walking the middle path between the two in order to create wholeness, gold, or the philosopher's stone. Crowley describes the secret of magic, quote, "Inflame thyself in praying." The mind must be exalted until it loses consciousness of self, just as the poet, the artist, is carried out of himself in a creative frenzy, so must be the magician. End quote, page 149. A life with magic is essentially a rational life infused with prayer, devotional love, directed at something beyond rational understanding. This is to consciously worship the divine or the dark, embody or evoke black, and rescue Sophia. To rescue Sophia is to rescue wisdom, something much different than the mind's intellect. We must become interested in Seelie, soul, not just mind. Modern life is filled with rituals, but they are only half alive without their magical half. They are all white light without black mystery, sterile. To infuse daily life with black is to infuse daily life with magic, with mystery, with faith. The ritual of cooking is infused with magic when the food is prayed over. We can't rationally explain why we do it or who we do it for, yet it means something to the individual experience and the individual reality, which is both rational and irrational. This is enchantment, bringing magic back to life. Tinkerbell, we believe in you. Perhaps modern magicians are not simple illusionary tricksters. Perhaps the modern magician is the metaphor himself, a metaphor of Maya. With an enchanted eye, we see the reflection of what contemporary magic has become, and through the reflection of our response, we find our true individual feelings about magic. And we don't just think about them logically, we experience them, we feel them in the body. Perhaps the modern magician is a symbol calling for re-enchantment. The magician points out to us our neglect to see him for what he is. That's his trick.